Well, for more, let's cross to Saul Iglesias, professor of political science at the University of the Philippines. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm actually in Paris right now for a conference.
You should be in the studio, Saul. You should not. Oh, but I understand you had a previous engagement and couldn't make it our way today. Let me ask you: is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. his own man, or do Filipinos have a short memory?
Well, he's certainly banking on the legacy of his father. He made a nod to former President Duterte as well in his inaugural speech. So he is really portraying himself not just as a continuity sort of figure from President Duterte, whose political capital he relied upon, especially in the form of his running mate, Vice President Sara Duterte, but very much that myth of a golden age that he's hitching his wagon to when it comes to his father's brutal dictatorship.
His father's brutal dictatorship, which was overthrown and at the end was hugely unpopular 36 years ago. He's taking over, like you say, with his predecessor's daughter as his vice president. Are there any indications whether it's going to be continuity or change?
Well, continuity in probably in a number of respects. Certainly, economic policies are not going to be too different. Marcos Jr. Referred to build, build, build type of infrastructure, just as an example, with former President Duterte. It's another question what this means, though, with this tandem with Sara Duterte. Certainly, Mr. Marcos will have more incentives than not to ensure that this coalition between himself, Ms. Duterte, and the other dynasties in which they have forged this winning coalition that has brought him, in some sense, back to the Malacanang Palace, the presidential palace. But we need to pay attention to also potential friction along the way. Because you ask whether Marcos is his own man. There's also a question of the extent to which Ms. Duterte is her own woman, in relation to Mr. Marcos. Some early signs of possible friction. It was mentioned in the overview that you provided that Sara Duterte will be education secretary or minister in the new government, but she made her preference for being Secretary of National Defense very publicly clear. She has accepted the cabinet position graciously, but these are signs of trouble in paradise, so to say.
And what about the road the democracy will be taking under this term? Will we see the extrajudicial killings that we saw under the previous administration, crackdowns on freedom of the press?
I think that one thing we may not see, but I can't say for sure, would be the type of violence of the war on drugs that was very much a signature of President Duterte. During the campaign, at least, Mr. Marcos indicated pretty clearly, on one hand, that he wouldn't be, pursuing that sort of violence, although he would still continue some kind of anti-drug crime campaign with a different emphasis, possibly on rehabilitation. At least that's what he said during the campaign. There will always be a temptation, perhaps in the future, now that this has happened at this scale, this kind of violence, to perhaps in the future use it again to create fear in society, as Mr. Duterte did. But the likelihood, at least for now, seems to be pretty low. The bigger question is the crackdown against opponents, political opponents, dissidents, protesters, journalists, lawyers. There are already signs that there's probably going to be more continuity on that front rather than discontinuity.
And one final question for you. What was your personal reaction when you saw 92-year-old Imelda Marcos kiss her son on stage during the inauguration?
Well, I must say that if I have a bias, it's for democracy. So my fear at these kinds of images is that, there are ominous signs of continued democratic backsliding toward authoritarian rule. And what we've seen in the Marcos campaign, for instance, his unwillingness to engage with professional journalists, for example, these kinds of restrictions on or signs of possible future restrictions on civil liberties, the fact that the ability of people to protest the inauguration was heavily limited. These sorts of things do not bode well for the future of Philippine democracy, which by some accounts is already counted as having died under President Duterte's term.
Saul Iglesias, many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you very much.